Okay, so I'm going to begin this. This is going to be very brief, and it's just going to be a quick rundown of my personal bona fides, where these teachings came from. I alluded to this in my first video, but I wanted to talk a little bit about it since I do think it's important that whenever we are dealing with traditional materials, that we talk about who our teachers were. We talk about where we got the teachings that we got, where this all began for us. And in order to give an indication that, what we're talking about is real, it's not just something that, I read a couple books and pulled this out of my ass and now I know what I'm talking about. So I wanted to just talk very briefly about this so that you can get a sense of where my sources are, and that's what I call my personal origins or my pathways into the forest. Now, I came into contact with the runes and runic information in 3 stages or at 3 different points. The first time I ever laid eyes on the runes came through this book that a lot of people know about, which is the Book of Runes by Ralph Blum. And this book was published in the early 80s. I don't even remember the exact. It's like 81, 82, something like that. I don't even remember the exact year it was. And I was working at the Renaissance Festival in Kansas City, Missouri. And I had my first spiritual teacher. I had a booth there. Her name was Terry Cat Fortune, or we called her Catty. And she was in some ways just sort of a natural kitchen witch, for those of you who know what that is. But she liked to collect different types of divinatory devices. And of course, this book came out, and so she just got a copy of it. Now, I did not learn the runes from this book. What ended up happening was that I saw, not this book initially, but I saw the little ceramic tiles, the crappy little ceramic tiles that come with the book. And I just saw the forms. She had like pulled the box out, and the runes were just sort of laying there on her table in her booth. She was looking at them. And I looked at them and had a really weird reaction. I had a reaction that I have really never had before or since to any kind of spiritual material. I looked at them and I knew what they were. And furthermore, I knew what they meant. In other words, like I knew what each specific glyph meant. And I had never seen them before. It was like remembering something. And I was very taken with them and obsessed with them. And so eventually I looked at the book. She pulled the book out because I asked her about them, and I looked at the book, and I knew that this book was crap. In fact, I read the front part of it, and he basically says in the front part of it, yeah, I was exposed to these runes, but I lost the order that they were supposed to come in. So I just sort of started pulling stuff, you know what I mean? So he basically just, he based his interpretation and introduction of the runes based entirely on what they meant to him and maybe a little bit of research. And I just somehow knew that that didn't have anything to do with me in particular. And I also could tell that he was wrong about some of the meanings of the runes. I mean, I don't know why I knew that, but I just knew it. So I just, but I kept that in my head. About a year later, I was introduced to my spiritual teacher who taught me about the runes, or introduced me to the runes in the following way. I was working, this began in like 1983 or 84, I was working at a place called New Earth Bookstore in Kansas City, Missouri. And I was the book buyer there. Somehow I got that job. I was okay at it, but it was my job to pay attention to groups or events or people that we might sponsor to come into town and do certain kinds of things or events where we could participate in it. We sort of operated as a clearinghouse for different types of alternative spiritual and women's events and neo-pagan events, lesbian and gay events. That was really before those kinds of things were even legal, essentially in Missouri. But one of the acts that I checked out, and we never actually got connected to them, but I checked them out, were a group of firewalkers that had come to Kansas City, and they were giving a series of public exhibitions. And there were various members of the alternative spiritual community and sort of the early neo-pagan community that I was also connected to at that time, who were interested in this event. And so I went to their sort of meeting. And one of the things they did at the first meeting was they did an exhibition, and then they explained that they were going to do a series of other exhibitions. But if you wanted to learn how to do this, they would take you through a training orientation. But you had to make a certain commitment to come a certain number of times, and they would train you how to do it. And then you could walk on the fire, walk on the coals yourself. So I decided that sounded kind of cool, and so I decided to do it. Well, it just so happened they were going to be in town for like 3 weeks. It just so happened that one of the women who was teaching this fire walking and whose first orientation I went to, her name was Kirsten, and she was a member of a family group in Sweden. She came from a rural area in Sweden where the family still had a family tradition of doing these things, not of fire walking specifically, but of working with the runes, working with what is called trolldom, or as this book puts it, troll run. This trolldom is what it's called in Swedish, and troll run is what it's called in Norwegian. Same thing. In other words, folk traditions that incorporate the runes as well as a number of traditional other practices like Sather, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so for some reason, she took a liking to me. I don't particularly know why, maybe because I was really inquisitive. And she just decided in the little over 2 weeks that she was there, that she would download some of this information, just give it to me. And so we ended up meeting a number of times, usually after one of these orientation sessions. And she would just talk to me, and she would not let me take notes. I had to memorize everything she was saying. It was sort of like my first experience in oral communication. Now, what I would do is I would listen really carefully to what she said, and as soon as I left, I would write down as much as I could remember, and I could remember much of it, or it would come back to me later. But one of the things she told me towards the end of that period was that if I carefully applied myself to some of the techniques that she showed me, and she showed me some breathing techniques, and she showed me some what are on the right hand here, what are called calming techniques. And what calming is it's a way of vocalizing. It's a way of vocalizing letter sounds, mostly vowels, essentially. And calling is probably best known in Scandinavia as a way to call cattle from long distances. It's actually the basis for yodeling and yoiking and a number of other things that Northern European and Baltic peoples do. And in Scandinavia, it's particularly known as something that women do, but men do it too. And when she described it to me, first showed it to me, I realized that my grandfather did this. He did something like this. And he had been taught to do this by one of his aunts when he was living with her on her farm and learning to become a farmer. And he called his cattle that way. So it was like I had already been exposed to that. But the reason why calling is important is that it's one of the ways in which Galder is used magically so that when you call cattle, you're not just calling them, you're actually calling them in a particular way with certain formulas, and it's a way of throwing your voice. And I will try to demonstrate some of that when I talk specifically about doing this. Actually, if I do it with full intensity, it will fuzz out the speakers here, but I'll do it, or the microphone, but I'll do it to the best of my ability when I do it. But so she taught me a little bit of that. She taught me a little bit of what is called Galder. She told me about Sather. We did not do Sather because Sather is a different, it's a whole thing, as when I describe it, you'll see. But she did tell me about the background of Sather, what Sather consists of. And as part of both the orientation process to Firewalk, which, by the way, I did do eventually. I actually walked across the fire pit 3 times. Did not burn my feet, but I did singe the bottom of my pants. You have to go into an altered state of consciousness to do this. And she taught me certain breathing techniques in which to do this, which I did then later expand when I did my experiments with Sather in the 1980s, several years after I knew her. I basically took these breathing exercises and expanded on them after doing a little bit of research, and found that there are various ways in which you can change your consciousness based on how you breathe. So anyway, that was my second introduction to the background of this. And then going back a slide, my third introduction was to Futhark. While I was at this bookstore, I was still working at this bookstore. It was about a year after I had known Kirsten. Edred Thorson published this book, Futhark, which I knew was going to be better than Ralph Blum's book, and it does contain good information in it. What I didn't know at the time, and what a reader of Futhark should understand, is that a lot of the material, a lot of the interpretive approach that Edred takes to Futhark is a mixture of linguistic scholarship that is at least 100 to 150 years old, so it's a little outdated, and some material that is not historical at all, that actually comes from the Pan-German Renaissance Findecycla period of the early 20th century, including some of the stuff by Guido von List and a number of other people that are not actually, these don't really represent traditional teachings. They represent teachings that were developed in Germany and in certain parts of Scandinavia, but they don't represent sort of part of an ongoing tradition. But of course, I didn't know that at the time, and a lot of people who are reading Futhark now don't realize that about Futhark. And Edred was just presenting what he knew, and it was better than Blum. At least the Gothic Futhark is represented in its correct form, and he does link the Futhark to certain Galder practices, and everything that he does in this book is Galder. So it's important to understand that. So let me talk a little bit about what Galder is and Sather is, and then we'll end this, because I have a separate video that's going to deal just with those things. So essentially, when we're talking about the basis of rune magic, and Edred is where I first saw this division. What we'll see very quickly is that this division is largely an artificial one, but it is a division that is recognized by a lot of people. The first is the division between Galder and Sather. Galder is literally the use of word formulas. They are often associated, as I say, with runes in literature. It's to cast or set a spell or intention. You don't have to actually use runes in order to do Galder. Galder can be any spoken spell, or any spell like a culning. But oftentimes runes, because runes can encode language and can be used as a code, oftentimes runes are used. So if you use runes as a sigil, or you use runes in a runic formula, any of those kinds of things are considered Galder. So these formulas are often very complex. They use rhyming schemes, multi-level symbolism. You can use the runes to spell out the Galdor. Galdor, by the way, is just another way of spelling Galdor. They can be used to spell out Galdor. They can be used as bind runes or sigils, like I said. Oftentimes in the literature, Galdor is associated with men's magic, but it's not exclusive to men at all. And in fact, if you look at the compilations of spell work in Trolldom, which is one of the books that I showed you in the last video, or this book right here, which we'll talk about later, which is called Troll Run, what you'll find is that, when women are setting spells, they use runes too. Runic sigils get passed down and get, mixed and matched and everything. So even though runes were often considered men's magic, Kirsten introduced me to them as well. And obviously my female teacher introduced me to just the forms of the runes. So those divisions don't really hold up when looked at realistically. Now, Seidr is an older technique, and in fact, I'm not the only person who says this. Maria Philhaug and Nigel Pinnock and a number of other authorities talk about how the runes grew out of a cultural complex that already existed, and that's pretty clear. And even Edred has to admit that and even the myths talk about that in a sense, that kind of Seidr predated the runes, and that the runes encode certain aspects of Seidr. In fact, without Seidr, the runes probably wouldn't exist, so to speak. So what Seidr is a type of trance technique. It may use word formulas as incantations or invocations or evocations. And there are two main goals of Seidr. One is to connect with ancestral or otherworldly beings for the purposes of divination, or sometimes for healing, in which case it's sort of like a shape-shifting. You send your spirit out in an animal form to heal. Seidr can also be used in offensive attack, sort of like astral attack. There are some instances where it's being portrayed as being used that way. Now, what's interesting is that in Icelandic sources, this practice is passed down through women in a family. This is what is portrayed and is often depicted as Finnish in origin. And what I mean by that is that the clothing that the women in the Icelandic sagas are wearing, the clothing and items and practices that are being portrayed are Finnish. They appear to be Finnish, but obviously they have to be something other than that, because there's plenty of evidence of Scandinavian and Germanic peoples doing types of Seidr too. And in the Norse myths, Freya is considered to be the great Seithkona, or the great female practitioner of Seidr. And it is said that she taught Seidr to Odin. So obviously this is not just simply something that's Finnish. And this was clearly not a female practice. Even though Seidr became associated with women's magic, it is very clear even in the sagas that men do Seidr. And in fact, Odin does Seidr. He was taught to do Seidr according to the stories. And so he does it too. And in fact, some argue, Maria Philhaug argues that, the whole practice of Odin sacrificing himself on the world tree and going into this trance state, this tortured trance state, and seizing up the runes, that is an act of Seidr, that is one of the practices of Seidr. So, and she uses various examples and linguistic cues and keys in order to understand that. So, even though in the literature you'll often see these two types of magic being differentiated from each other, it's mostly a matter of sort of technique or emphasis. It is possible to do Seidr without the runes, although you're probably going to do some kind of Galdor. It is possible to do Galdor without Seidr, but a lot of the formulas of Galdor come from a Seidr-like activity. So you see how they are actually connected. Now, what Kirsten did teach me was that I had to learn, and I haven't learned this perfectly. I've only done this 2 or 3 times, but she said that I would be well placed to learn the art of utiseta, which literally means sitting out. And this was a practice of vision questing that is portrayed in a number of Scandinavian sources. And it's very much the same as seeking a vision in other traditions. What they would do is they're often portrayed as they would go to a burial mound for the purposes of visionary traveling, divination, healing, knowledge, etc. But if a burial mound isn't available, then you would go to a high place. So like the top of a mountain or the top of a rock cliff. You would go someplace where and usually it's emphasized that you want to be in like a high place so that you can see. There's this whole idea in Sather and also in the myths of being on the high seat. Like Odin sits on the high seat so that he can oversee all the worlds. Freya sits on a high seat as well. And so the idea is that if you are going to sit out, it's important for you to find a high place to sit on. Because it sort of elevates your sense of consciousness. And these ideas are not new. I mean, you find these among the Algonquin peoples here in the Northeast United States and in many other cultures. So that's what utiseta is. Now, like I said, I've only done utiseta completely maybe 2 or 3 times. And there are all kinds of practices that attend this, including fasting, chanting, breathing exercises, the same kinds of things that you would find for any other kind of vision quest. But that's what utiseta is. And utiseta is, while you're doing utiseta, it's possible for you to do a kind of individual Sather. High ritual Sather was a community activity. It was done for communities, within communities, and that's how it's often portrayed in the sagas. And when I did do Sather, I only did it for communities. I only did it within communities. So that's probably part of the reason why I didn't do a whole lot of vision questing until kind of later. But anyway, I wanted to give that kind of an introduction. I never saw Kirsten again after she left. For her, it was sort of a download, and then she was out of there. She did tell me, though, that if I committed myself to these practices and used the runes as kind of a mechanism of focus, that I would be taken to places that I would not expect, and that I would know this by virtue of dreams that I might have. And when it was maybe about a year after she had left, I did have a very specific dream about Odin. And Odin appeared to me. It was so strange. In the dream, I went to this bakery shop, and Odin and Thor appeared to me, and they both appeared to me as these very elaborate sort of baked goods, which I think was very strange. But Odin came alive out of this baked good, and he told me. Now, why he appeared as a baked good, I have no idea. But he told me, he showed me a rune. He showed me a runic, what's called a tine. It's a combination of runes. Of runic forms. And he said, when you see this, in the future, you will see this runic form again. And when you do, pay attention, because that means that things are going to change for you. Well, I had that dream, it was way back in 1983 or 84. And honestly, I forgot about it. I forgot about the dream entirely. I even forgot sort of what the runic form was, because I just went on and did what I do and went through all the various changes in my life, doing the various different traditions that I've worked in, like the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition and the Sufi tradition, Buddhist tradition. About 4 years ago, I suddenly had a dream in which Odin appeared to me again, this time not as a baked good, but just as sort of a presence. And he showed me that rune again. And he showed me the way in which I'd seen it wrong. He showed me the way in which I'd seen it, and then how I was supposed to see it, and then what it meant for me personally. And he said one thing to me, and he said, heal my house. and then he left. And that was when I remembered the previous dream. It was like while I was dreaming the first dream, I remembered the second dream. And so that's sort of what I've been living with now ever since, is that rune and what it represents and what it really means, and for me, and what he meant by heal my house. And I remember I told this story to Leilani, excuse me, I always say her name wrong, Leilani Flor Celestial, who is a friend of mine on Facebook, who is a, she is an amazing practitioner in her own Cuban Taino tradition. And I told her, I kind of feel like it's time for me to talk about this stuff. And she said, well, maybe you should talk about this stuff, but it's taken me like 4 years to talk about this stuff. Anyway, so now I'm doing it. But I will end this video here and go on to the next one.